the cloud.
Okay, great.
Okay. All right. Have a great session.
Okay, thank you much. I guess we'll wait just 1 minute. I want to be very timely in this, since we have a lot to cover.
Well, it is really good to see everyone, even if we're not in person.
Actually, why don't we go ahead and get started? Because we have 4 papers in only 1 hour. I've asked each of the presenters to limit to 8 to 10 minutes, and the discussants to 6 minutes each, so that theoretically that leaves us with what is it, something like 12 minutes or something like that for discussion at the end. But I know these things often run over, so I want to move quickly. This, I think, as most people here know, these papers generally come out of the 2 RRTCs we have going, Research and Rehabilitation Training Centers, funded by U.S. Department of Education. And one of those RRTCs is based at Syracuse on public policy affecting employment of people with disabilities. And the other is based at Rutgers on employer practices affecting people with disabilities. Both 5-year centers, and this is really the first presentation that we're of some of the work from that. We hope to have more presentation over the next few years. But with that, let me go ahead and get started with the presentations. I think it makes sense, oftentimes one has a presentation and then discussant comments. However, the 2 discussants are each discussing 2 papers, but they said they had general comments as well. Fitore and Sophie. So I think it probably makes sense for us to do all 4 presentations and then have the 2 discussants and any general discussion. So with that, I'll just go in order. Mason, I believe you're up first.
Yes. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to do a screen share real quick. Just 1 moment. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. As you can clearly tell, there's been a change in presentation. The paper originally proposed for this session was delayed due to IRB processing. In any case, this paper is entitled Small Empires: How Equipped Are Small Business Owners in Hiring People with Disabilities? And as the title might suggest, businesses that have fewer than 15 employees aren't required to follow the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. So this qualitative study explored small business owners and their knowledge of the ADA, their practices surrounding hiring for people with and without disabilities, and their sense of best practices for how a job candidate should navigate the interview and request accommodations if need be. 1 moment. Our entire interest in small businesses started with an earlier study where we discovered something unexpected. This was a study looking at disability bias, and one of the biggest offenders turned out to be very small firms. It raised a larger question on what happens from the employer side when issues of providing reasonable accommodations and ADA fulfillment in general aren't top of mind and are legally inconsequential. In other words, do SBOs, small business owners, even understand the laws as they scale, as they grow? But also, what should people with disabilities know about in regard to navigating interviews with these small business owners? On that note, there's a question on what people with disabilities should do when faced with the pain point of being in a job interview. Do you disclose your disability and need for accommodations or not disclose? And this is a controversial point in the literature. Some say hold back to avoid bias. And then there are those who say speak first to control the narrative and build trust. As a matter of fact, our previous work found that job candidates who did disclose their disability and need for accommodations fared better when they did it over video than over the phone, and that there was an extra penalty for disclosing too early. In a totally separate study, we also learned that barring disclosure in the name of impression making, people with disabilities are better off emphasizing their hard skills on the job, which signals their competence, instead of their soft skills, which signals their warmth, which brings me to the current study. We decided to explore this area just by hearing the stories of small business owners on how they handle hiring, what their experiences have been with job candidates or employees with disabilities, what they know or don't know about what will change as they scale, and what their preferences are for how job candidates should handle this process with them. To that end, we were able to cull 10 interviews with small business owners and identified 6 central themes to ground our understanding of the SBO disability employment experience. Now, in the interest of time and relevance for this session, I'm only addressing themes 4, 5, and 6. That said, and as you can see in red, SBOs preferred that people disclose their disabilities up front. With that in mind, for every SBO, they had a personal tie with disability, and I'll unpack that in a moment. And finally, ADA awareness was predominantly mixed. It was, quite frankly, all over the place. What I'd like to do is unpack some of their explanations about what these issues have been like for SBOs, starting with theme number 4. Now, in regard to SBOs preferring disability disclosure upfront, we heard this argument come up in conversation after conversation. The majority of SBOs explained that being upfront is necessary for protecting the trust per se, but also being upfront is a matter of allowing an SBO to figure out whether and how to provide accommodations. Case in point, let me know what you can do, let me know what your limitations are, and then let me make a decision on whether it works for me. I'm making an investment in you way more than you're making an investment in me. It's such powerful indication that this matter of trust can be easily broken if individuals who choose not to disclose, aren't willing to at least consider the other end of the spectrum. And this is where this kind of territory of do we disclose, not disclose becomes extremely fuzzy. With that said, apparently this is an argument for being more proactive than reactive. And transparency is critical to ensuring a smooth hiring and onboarding experience. In fact, one SBO actually explained that the decision to disclose is also telling of an applicant's character, especially if someone is prone to encounter bias. Owning their otherness, as they mentioned it, by appreciating what's unique about their experiences, things that have potentially made them stronger maybe, might be of value in countering stereotypes. But overall, these remarks, among the many that allude to the theme, these are all related to the idea of job applicants joining the family. There was one SBO who said, I want to hear more about you and all about you. It's a major takeaway here, and it's likely a very different feeling than when engaging with larger organizations. Now, moving towards theme number 5, it was interesting to learn that every SBO had a relationship with disability. This wasn't part of the protocol, right? Like we didn't actually try to pinpoint SBOs that had some sort of personal experience with disabilities. It was just luck. Some participants had disabilities themselves, whereas others experienced it through their families, friends, coworkers. One SBO in life coaching who has bipolar disorder and PTSD expressed motivation to level the playing field by recruiting interns with disabilities through remote work. There was this other SBO who, has a disability themselves and understands the struggle, but the question for them was more so about whether they could even afford accommodations in their current growth stage. Case in point, I feel sorry for my staff that has to deal with me on some days when I'm all over the place. Now, mind you, she has ADHD. I get it. And I believe that within reason, you can accommodate somebody else by making those changes. They may get there differently. It might not be my way of getting there, but if they get there and the result is the same, then God bless. I don't care. That's it. And lastly, when we look to ADA awareness, perhaps unsurprisingly, SBOs didn't have a grasp of the HR practices associated with the ADA, including whether the law even applied to them or Whether they were in compliance or not, to put it mildly, not many knew where to begin. Though one SBO in furniture retail who has an HR background knew that smaller companies have more leeway. Another SBO in advertising had the same understanding, but the difference was that because they had a little bit more cash flow, they deferred to an HR consultant from time to time on a need-be basis and explained that the lack of rules on hiring among small businesses was in and of itself an area of concern. Case in point, nothing applies to us. We're so tiny. Literally no regulations apply to us. We can do whatever we want. It's shocking. Even for leave policy, maternity leave, we don't have to follow any of that, but we do, and our employees expect it. It's the right thing to do personally and professionally. It's so sad that accommodations aren't required for every employer. And that's an interesting point that she makes in the end, because each SBO that we interviewed had good intentions to providing accommodations for qualified people with disabilities, providing they could foot the bill. And all in all, what we can say so far from this preliminary work is that SBOs care about the people they hire, like truly care about the people they hire, perhaps more so than larger firms might. Joining the family is a big deal to them, leading many of our participants to note that early disclosure would be appreciated in this setting. And while we didn't cover the theme of impression making, at least in this talk, I think it's important to note that most SBOs emphasize the importance of soft skills because to them, the hard skills can be taught. Now, keep in mind that we've just begun to scratch the surface on the SBO experience. In fact, our second wave of research that's launching in the next few weeks will examine medium-sized firms and how they navigate the ADA, especially as the law applies to them at this stage. So hopefully we'll have a stronger understanding of how this learning curve unfolds. But that's essentially the long and the short. That concludes my presentation, and I'm gonna pass the mic to our next participant, our next speaker. And then of course, our discussants will break it down a bit further. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to clarify later on, and just feel free to reach out. I'm certainly we can discuss here. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Mason. That's really interesting. This is the first I've seen, and you raised some really good points. But let's move right on to Nanette.
Are you seeing what you're supposed to be seeing? Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, hi, I'm Nanette Goodman. I'll be talking about disability inclusion and supplier diversity programs. This is work I've done with co-authors Lauren Gilbert at Rutgers and some folks at BBI as part of the Disability Inclusive Employment Center. So hopefully Lauren will not be scrunching her eyes when she hears what I have to say. That'll be my, my judge. So today we're going to talk a little bit about supplier diversity. What are supplier diversity initiatives? Why include disability-owned businesses in these initiatives? And what type of Fortune 500 companies include disability in their supplier diversity programs? So first I want to say these initiatives operate in this really complex supply chain. So companies are monitoring suppliers to make sure they're not using child labor or toxic chemicals while trying to make sure they have a steady supply of goods. So who owns the supplier company seems to be a tiny issue, and only in the US and to a lesser extent in the UK. So according to a couple of studies, private supplier diversity programs grew out of the federal government 8A program, and that's really what drove this research. This is part of the policy center that Doug was talking about. So the idea of the 8A program was to level the playing field for disadvantaged groups. And I was reading a report by the Congressional Research Service that talked about how racial and ethnic minority groups are considered presumptively eligible for the 8A program. And it said that people with disabilities don't need to be presumptively eligible because they're part of another program, another government program, and it went to a footnote. And the footnote talked about the Ability One program. You know, the program that requires the government to buy certain goods from nonprofits that employ people with disabilities. You know, the one that has sheltered workshops and work teams. That's what they were equating this with. So the fact that a government agency whose papers go through a lot of levels of review conflates disability owned with employees in people with disabilities in low-level jobs pointed out that we have like a way to go toward equity. And let me tell you that this was the first and probably the last time in my life that a footnote is going to energize me this much. So we're going to learn that supplier diversity programs are in large part window dressing. But it introduces to us the idea that people with disabilities can own businesses and that the private sector is starting to recognize this, and it's time for the public sector to catch up. So why do we need, so why should people with disabilities be included in supplier diversity programs? Like other disadvantaged groups, disability-owned businesses tend to have less social capital, maybe smaller, and maybe less able to fill large contracts. So they really need to be part of these proactive programs. So what did we do? First, we looked at websites and ESG reports to identify which of the Fortune 500 companies had supplier diversity programs. And if they did they include disability? And these sources actually gave us very little information. Generally, they just list the different categories that they include in their programs. Some other studies found that spending on diverse suppliers was about 6%, a pretty small percent of the overall supplier spend, and disability is even tinier. But what we found is that among the Fortune 500 companies, 190 included disability in their supplier diversity programs. And 90 specifically talked about using disability in to certify their Adobe's. Adobe is a disability-owned business enterprise, a very clever name. So we know from other research that there are disability-owned businesses, that people with disabilities do own businesses. Unfortunately, we don't know very much about them because disability isn't included on some of the major business surveys. But we know that there are about 1 to 2 million people with disabilities who are business owners. Disability In has certified 400 companies, and only 15% are over 10 employees. So this might be a little concerning since we just said 190 Fortune 500 companies are including disability-owned businesses. But Disability In does say that small business owners are hesitant to become disability certified for some of the same reasons that employees are hesitant to self-disclose, stigma and fear that the large companies won't think they're able to do the job. And some previous research has indicated that they're probably not wrong. Some large companies have said things like, we expect disability-owned businesses to actually produce. And they're like, yeah, we expect ourselves to produce the same also. So, there's still a lot of discrimination out there. So you can imagine companies, small companies, being a little gun shy about disclosing. So when we looked at our Fortune 500 companies, 125 did not have any supplier diversity programs, and among those with a supplier diversity program, almost half include Adobe's. So then what we did is with Doug's suggestion, we combined this with, we merged this with CompuStat data. So first, let me say, so for our Fortune 500 companies, what we see is that size is really the driving force. Small company, the 1 to 100, ranked 1 to 100, are much more likely to have supplier diversity programs and much more likely to include disability. That blue on the bottom is they don't have a program. The orange is they have a program but don't include disability. Gray is that they include disability somewhat. This is usually disabled vets, and the yellow is that they totally include disability. So then we merged the Fortune 500 data with CompuStat data, and this means we lost about 21 privately held companies. But what we find is that supplier diversity varies a lot by industry, with wholesale trade, mining, and construction less likely to have any program and less likely to include disability. where finance, transportation, and services and manufacturing were more likely to have programs and more likely to include disability. So again, what we find when we looked at a couple different measures of size, the number of employees and the total revenue. And again, what we find is that, that the size is really important. Larger companies are more likely to have a program, more likely to include disability. We also looked at their total revenue, their profit margins, and more profitable companies tend to be more likely to have programs and include disability. When we were reading the ESG reports, we started having this sense that not having a supplier diversity program was a little political, right? They would say, we make sure that everybody has equal access, things like that. So we started looking at whether we could predict anything by the percent politically conservative in the state. That's a little less clear, but it does look like the conservative thing does matter whether you have a program at all. And then we wanted to see if businesses that were forward facing, if they're trying to sort of look good to their constituents, whether that mattered. Again, it matters some. So then, but the other thing is we looked at the change from 2016, and what we found is that it wasn't these, it wasn't the Teslas of the world that had supplier diversity programs. It was the more, the larger, steady growth companies. It wasn't those like quick growth companies that seem to have the programs. So of course, if you include disability in your supplier diversity initiatives, your company will immediately become larger and more profitable. And I love this chicken because his scowl just is so annoyed that we even ask about correlation and causation. Just a little joke. But anyway, then we threw this all into a logit model, and we get some significant results for whether the company had a diversity program at all. But other than size, nothing seems to predict, given that they have a program, whether it includes disability. So what's next? We're going to take a qualitative approach, interviewing Dobies and large business owners to see if we can figure out what's going on. We're also going to be merging this with Fitore's data on whether companies include disability in their company statements, so we can understand the extent to which supplier diversity is part of a larger diversity inclusion strategy. And this is also part of a larger research endeavor where we're looking at the inclusion of disability-owned businesses in state procurement diversity initiatives. So in conclusion, we have work to do.
Great. Thank you very much, Nanette. We'll move right on to the next. If you could stop the screen sharing. Yeah. The next presentation will be by Lisa Schur. And oh dear, let me just make sure I can share the screen here. Share screen, because I'm running her slide here.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Take it away, Lisa.
Yes, so I want to thank co-authors Doug and Mason and Lauren Gilbert also, who worked extensively on this. So this paper looks at paid sick leave mandates and the employment of people with disabilities. So looking at this issue, having a paid sick leave program could help workers keep jobs and maintain labor market connections when they experience ill health. And the question is whether the positive effects may be larger for workers with disabilities who may be at greater risk of sickness and other health problems. But it's really unclear how government mandates for paid sick leave affect employment outcomes. It is possible, right, that employers may be reluctant to hire workers who have health risks, including people with disabilities, because they're worried about workplace disruptions and the costs when illnesses occur. And they're also going to assume that people with disabilities are going to have higher illnesses. But on the other hand, these mandates may have positive effects on labor supply, because by drawing more people into the workforce, that's going to increase employment for people with disabilities and increase retention. 16 states plus Washington, D.C. and 29 localities have implemented paid sick leave mandates since 2008, and they include our great state of New Jersey as one of them. And there have been 3 prior studies that have looked at this, at the effect in general of paid sick leave mandates and the employment effect of these laws. And they've been split on their findings. So one found negative employment effects the first year when Connecticut adopted the law in 2012. Another study found no clear effects of the laws, looking at data through 2016. And the third study found positive effects of laws using data through 2019. But no studies have looked at the effects of these laws on people with disabilities. So our big research questions are, how do state paid sick leave mandates affect employment outcomes in general? And do the effects differ for people with disabilities? The data come from the American Community Survey, 2008 to 2020, and we matched the ACS data to state laws, including the enactment date, the effective date, and the law's provisions. We also used a wide range of controls from ACS, and these included gender, race, ethnicity, age, education, whether you live alone, the presence of children or senior citizens in the household, and all of these controls were interacted with disability. The methods are a triple difference framework, looking at 1, before and after the laws were enacted, 2, looking at adopters and non-adopters, and 3, looking at people with disabilities and those without disabilities. It's based on regressions of employment outcomes on state law enactment and adoption and state fixed effects, all interacted with disabilities. Now, there's a possible problem of differential pre-trends. States that adopted these laws may have had faster growth before adoption. So it's really important to look at, to try and figure out what would the outcome have been without the adoption of these laws, and adjust using a pre-adoption cohort trends to predict the outcome if adoption hadn't occurred. So what were the results? Paid sick leave mandates are linked to higher labor force participation in employment and lower unemployment. The effects also appear to be greater for people with disabilities. And the next slide shows this figure here. It's not super easy to look at, but the darker line are the employment rates of people with disabilities, and the lighter line are people without disabilities. And you can see that the darker line is greater, and it also increases as you go along through time. It's also interesting that we found a link of these laws to self-employment, and that was confusing because people who are self-employed aren't covered. So why could this be? It could be because the higher incomes that employees get from paid sick leave could lead to greater consumer demand for goods and services, which would benefit self-employed people. We also find paid sick leave is positively linked to the hours and weeks worked, wage income, self-employment income, and total income, but we didn't find any link to public disability income, which was interesting. Okay, so a note of caution here. The results seem to be sensitive to how the pre-trends are accounted for. So we presented results using all of the years for the pre-adoption trends, and obviously showing positive employment effects for people both with and without disabilities. But if you restrict the pre-adoption trends to before 2014, the positive employment effect only seems to occur for people without disabilities. So that needs to be looked at more carefully. So this is just the first project. What are the next steps? We want to account for provisions of the laws, including employer size coverage and accrual rates. We're going to use synthetic control methods for each adopting state. And we want to compare by different types of disability, such as, what the ACS uses, the visual, hearing, cognitive, mobility impairments, difficulty with self-care, or difficulty going outside alone. And it's very important, we want to examine the intersection of disability with gender, race, ethnicity, education, and age, because it's quite possible that these effects vary once you look at intersectionality. So perhaps, white people are with disabilities are faring better than Black people with disabilities. We don't know at this point. And finally, we want to extend the analysis to paid family and medical leave laws and see what the effects of employment of those laws are. So thanks. Welcome questions and comments later.
Great. Thank you, Lisa.
Yep.
And last but definitely not least, Yana is going to be presenting on the disability and telework. I'll just mention, I did see that Abe is in the audience here. He did a really interesting presentation earlier today on racial differences in telework during the pandemic. So I'll be interested in any reactions and thoughts he may have on this, but take it away, Yana. We can't hear you, Yana.
Unmute, there we go. Okay, now people can see the screen. Great. So this is joint work with everybody here at the session. Sori Park did excellent statistical work, Lisa, Mason, and Doug. So what we are looking at is telework and the effect of telework on people with disabilities. And we've seen that despite some economic advances in some areas, there's been little economic progress in others, especially in terms of employment rates. People with disabilities are considerably less likely to be employed compared to people without disabilities. And even when they are employed, they're overrepresented in low earnings jobs and contingent jobs with few benefits or opportunity for advancement. And 1/4 of people with disabilities live in poverty, which is double the rate of people without disabilities. But on the plus side, and what we're looking at is the benefits of being able to work from home. And these benefits may be particularly helpful for workers who have disabilities, where the disabilities can make it difficult to commute or expensive to commute, or people have disabilities that require a more flexible schedule, for example, needing to get to appointments. So we are looking at really two things in this paper: the extent to which people with disabilities and without disabilities worked from home because of the pandemic. And we're also looking at the extent to which tighter labor markets, as states began to recover during the pandemic, the extent to which that translated into more employment for people with and without disabilities and more telework arrangements. With the working hypothesis is that during tight labor markets, employers are more likely to reduce their barriers for hiring. So we would expect to see an increase in overall employment for people with disabilities, as well as an increase in telework. So as I mentioned in the introduction, people with disabilities have considerably lower employment rates compared to people without disabilities. And you can see that here, the bottom two trend lines, the lighter blue, are for people with disabilities. And you can see that those lines are considerably below the darker trend lines, which are for people without disabilities. And also employment rates are lower for women than for men. And you can see the interaction there of gender and disability as well. So why the low employment rates for people with disabilities? Well, there's some labor supply reasons and some labor demand reasons. On the supply side, it could be that for people who have disabilities, employment is costly or difficult to obtain because of the additional costs, let's say needing to have accessible transportation. There may be less time or less energy for employment because of intensive schedules for therapy, lower education and training levels. Social isolation may be a factor. And there is some evidence showing that disability income like SSDI and SSI may have a dampening effect on employment rates for people with disabilities. On the labor demand side, employers may be reluctant to hire people with disabilities because they have concerns about productivity or the costs of providing accommodations. And there may be disadvantages due to corporate culture as well as outright discrimination and prejudice. And there's been some audit studies and experimental studies that demonstrate clearly that this kind of discrimination does exist. There is hope. Employment is now higher than it was before the pandemic for people with disabilities. And what this chart does is look at employment rates each month using CPS data compared to the employment rate right before the pandemic broke out, so the first quarter of 2020. And we can see that people without disabilities, the darker blue and the green lines are just about back at the pre-pandemic level. But for people with disabilities, both men and women, employment rates are actually greater than, so above the 100% line compared to the pre-pandemic, that first quarter of 2020. Why have we seen this improvement for people with disabilities more recently? Well, strong labor markets have been particularly good for people with disabilities. And also employers have been probably more willing to make accommodations for workers with disabilities, including provisions for telework and other kinds of flexible work arrangements. So before the pandemic even broke out, people with disabilities had a higher likelihood of working primarily from home, although that gap was slowly starting to close over time. But we saw a big limit on the potential for expanding telework. And this, it turns out, affected the likelihood of telework during the pandemic. For people with disabilities, only about 1/3 are in jobs where the essential tasks can be done primarily from home, compared to about 2/5 of workers without disabilities. And most of that is because of working in sectors and occupations where it's difficult or if not impossible to do the work at home. Jobs like food service jobs, home health aides, and many manufacturing jobs. So as a result of this, if you look at the far right side of this chart, this is using that same ACS data that Lisa was describing. During the pandemic, so going from 2019 to 2020, we actually saw a greater likelihood of people without disabilities working primarily at home compared to people with disabilities. Okay, that was 8 minutes. So let me come to the punchline. I don't want to take too much time. What we saw was increases in telework between 2019 and 2020 did not vary much by disability type or gender. And the relative increase in telework was especially low among people who have disabilities who were white, Asian, or more educated. We used the CPS data to run full-scale regressions, multivariable regressions, looking at the likelihood of working from home. And once we controlled for a whole host of productivity characteristics, we saw that only people with cognitive impairments and mobility impairments were more likely to do telework as a result of the pandemic. And finally, our most interesting result also is that tighter labor markets across states as measured by state unemployment rates were good for greater employment. It did increase the likelihood of employment, any kind of employment, as well as telework employment. And the share of any kind of employment that was taken up by telework was even greater for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities. So we conclude that tight labor markets are particularly favorable for people with disabilities in terms of being able to work or obtain telework arrangements. One potential barrier is that people with disabilities are less likely to live in homes that have internet access or even go to locations with internet access. So our conclusions are that there may have been a silver lining for some workers from the pandemic in terms of working from home. And another silver lining was the tight labor markets that we've seen in recent months. But telework is not a panacea. People with disabilities are less likely to do remote work because they are in jobs that are not as easy to be, that cannot be done as easily from home. We also need to keep in mind that telework may increase employment opportunities, but other things matter as well, like fair pay, accommodations, and equal opportunities for promotions. So it's good that the pandemic is shaking up traditional workplace structures, but we do need to think of ways in which we can expand workplace accommodations, especially in essential tasks that traditionally have not been amenable to telework. And with that, I'll close.
Great. Thank you very much, Yana. We'll move right on to the discussants. We've got Fitore and Sophie, and I think in the program, Fitore is listed first, so we'll start with her. Fitore Hyseni from Syracuse.
Hi there. Hello, everyone. I'll try to keep it short. I'll put a timer for 5 minutes and try to stick to that time so that Sophie has a few minutes to discuss her comments as well. My name is Fitore Hyseni, and as Doug said, I'm going to discuss 2 papers today, and then Sophie will discuss the last 2 papers presented by Lisa and Yana. I'll focus on the papers presented by Nanette and Mason. And I wanted to say first, I wanted to begin by thanking Doug for organizing this session, and say thanks to the presenters for sharing their excellent and groundbreaking research. I'll try to inform and get started our larger discussion, and hopefully we'll have some minutes dedicated to that at the end. I wanted to start by highlighting some of the key findings that stood out to me. I know both Nanette and Mason presented a few of their findings, and their papers have more details than that. But I wanted to focus on the key findings that stand out. Nanette and her team focused specifically on supplier diversity initiatives, which are a promising opportunity for small business owners with disabilities to become part of these larger corporate networks. And despite their potential, Nanette showed that only 75% of Fortune 500 companies have actually supplier diversity programs. And then from those, only half include disability. A similar work done by Ball and colleagues some 20 years ago found that 73% of companies, Fortune 500 companies, had supplier diversity policies, but only 15% included disabilities. So compared to the results in that shared today, that was half compared to 15%. So I think there's some progress, and a study I and my colleagues are conducting to measure inclusion of disability in broadly in diversity policies shows similar progress, slow over 20 years, but there's still progress. Nanette also shared with us that even though at an exploratory level, factors such as size of company, revenue, industry, regulatory requirements, and barriers for small businesses to be certified are key to understanding why or why not disability is being included in these supplier diversity practices. Mason and his team, on the other hand, they also focused in a way on businesses and their disability inclusion practices. They, through in-depth interviews, explored in particular hiring practices of small businesses with less than 15 employees, which, as Mason explained, they're not required to comply with the ADA. I will focus on a couple of findings, but I want to say that I found the paper very, very insightful because it provided a much needed attention to the decision-making process of small businesses that is lacking currently in literature. Most of the literature focus on hiring examines larger businesses, so we don't have this insight on smaller businesses. What stood out to me from the findings was that small business owners prefer upfront disability disclosure and tend to tie it to trust and availability of resources. Mason explained during his presentation today that they've actually previously shown through their work that early disclosure is associated with worse outcomes. So that's interesting that these small business owners prefer workers to disclose early. Another key finding is that there is a lack of knowledge about the ADA and where to turn for guidance in hiring and accommodating people with disabilities. It remains to be seen if this applies to medium-sized or larger businesses as well. A similar thread shared by both papers that came out indirectly is the importance of resources to implement inclusive practices and gain the required knowledge and expertise to implement them. I'm aware that future studies with Fortune 500 companies are going to come out from the RTCs funded by Neidler that Doug mentioned, and that Nanette and Mason are part of, and they're going to explore how to best implement these diversity inclusion practices and measure their effect on individual and company level outcomes. I found that these two papers complemented and informed each other very well and suggested some exciting new venues for research. For example, Mason suggested that ADA knowledge and compliance remains limited, and they're going to explore if that's the case for medium-sized businesses. Nanette, on the other hand, mentioned that the next stage of research will involve interviews with Dobies, and I'm interested to see how those results compare to Mason's findings, and also if there are any avenues to explore familiarity with ADA and hiring practices of Dobies, and if the knowledge can then be used to share with other small business owners and provide guidance to them. I assume that Dobies would have a much better knowledge of ADA and hiring when it disability when it comes to hiring practices. I'll stop here. I do have one last comment that will tie all papers together, and that's just about the role of COVID-19. I know it didn't come up in Nanette's and Mason's papers, but it remains to be seen how the effect of COVID-19 and shifts we saw in the workplace will play out in diversity inclusion practices. A question is if business owners are going to be more mindful of disability post-pandemic, and if there will be any differences as a function of firm size and industry as it came out on these two papers. But I'll stop here so Sophie can add some comments.
That's the million-dollar question, is how this is going to shape up post-pandemic. Okay, great. And Sophie, would you be able to give us some comments?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this session, Doug, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss two papers. So I'm going to start with the paid sick leave paper. So I think that's a really important paper. It asks a very important question. When I started reading it, I thought, well, how come this hasn't been done before, right? I mean, I hadn't thought about this question, and it's so important for people with disabilities, as paid sick leave could interact with other policies that are, very relevant here, like short-term disability insurance or family leave or SSDI and SSI. So just, I'll limit myself to a couple of comments, and maybe I'll send more to the authors since I only have a few minutes. In the theoretical framing of the paper, I would add how paid sick leave is expected to impact output and productivity because it's going to have spillover effects by keeping employees healthy in the firm, that it might also affect job retention if employees do not have to look for work with such a benefit in neighboring towns or states. On the empirical specification, it's mentioned in the paper that such policies are also available at the local level. So I was wondering if you had thought about estimating the model with towns or cities policies. Since you have ACS data, I thought perhaps that's doable. And then in terms of the model, I was wondering if it is a triple difference estimator, because persons with disabilities are eligible to the sick leave policy. So I'm not sure that, I mean, maybe it's something to look into whether it does, in fact, it does provide a triple difference, or is it a double difference, but that is estimated for two groups and compared. And then as I started the interaction with other policies, it seems really important and the way to go in the future. And it's mentioned in the paper towards the end. And I think you find any effect on income. So paid sick leave having a positive effect on income for persons with disabilities. So that could have an impact on applications for SSI and SSDI. And not only on exits from the rolls, which is what is mentioned on the paper, in the paper. Then the second paper, so transitioning very quickly, the second paper on telework is very rich, very timely. It exploits two data sets. It has a lot of results. So my main reaction is, maybe you want to do two papers. Maybe you have two papers and not one paper. It might make it easier to present the results. In the ACS, you measure work from home in the past week. In the CPS, if I understood correctly, you're measuring work from home because of the pandemic for the past 4 weeks. So these are slightly different things, because in the CPS, you're measuring a self-report of pandemic-related telework, whereas in ACS, you're simply measuring telework. And then, so you have different time frames in your analysis of ACS and CPS. CPS, you have data until very recently. ACS, I was wondering if you have recent data, if it's already out, maybe the 21 data. Yeah, so in ACS, perhaps you could do the regression analysis as well, or perhaps that's something you have done. Now in figure 1, I thought based on ACS was fascinating with the reversal of the gap. And I was wondering to what extent for people with disabilities, perhaps disproportional job loss or job resignation affects the numbers that you're showing in figure 1. So because the figure 1 is focused only on workers, the extent to which workers with disabilities are teleworking. But if we have fewer workers with disabilities because they were more affected by job loss or resign more, then that could, to what extent is this driving this figure 1? So I was curious about that, and if you had looked into that. And then finally, the labor market tightening, I thought that was really a very interesting analysis and contributing to the literature on economic crisis and how workers with disabilities are affected. And the results seem quite encouraging so far. I mean, overall, there is an increased demand for teleworkers, and perhaps to some extent, persons with disabilities are taking this opportunity and meeting this demand. That's what it looks like. So is this temporary? Is it going to be sustained? Well, first, is the demand for teleworkers going to be sustained over time? And when the labor market is less tight, or if there's a recession, will persons with disabilities, will be able to sustain their increasing rate of likelihood of teleworking. So I thought that your results really open up questions for research in the near future. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and hopefully I wasn't too long.
No, great. Thank you very much. We only have, I think, 5 minutes officially, although maybe we can extend it over until Bernadette and Emily come and kick us out. But are there, of course, I have all kinds of thoughts and ideas, but I want to ask if others have thoughts and ideas and questions based on this, based on any of the papers or comments.
Can I have one comment on Mason's research paper? It's not directly related to what you're looking for, but your research reminded me of one of the paper that was written by Lyons and which was published in GAP, which says that when employer interview people with disability, they make their judgment, even though they do not say that, whether the disability that the interviewees have had some controllability on the part of the interviewee. If they believe that they could control the onset of disability, and then they think that interviewee was responsible for getting that disability, they tend to put pity on the interviewee, and then the hiring rate goes down because they kind of put some responsibility on that illnesses. Whereas when the interviewer believed that the people with disability really didn't have any controllability on the onset of disability, then they kind of admire having that difficulties but going through this their career, and the hiring rate tend to go up. So maybe in discussion, maybe somewhere in your research, it might not be a too bad idea to recommend a good strategy for people with disability when they do interview, so that if they happen to be responsible for a disability or anything, or just in general, it may be a good idea not to disclose whether they are really responsible for the disability or not, so that they don't provide unnecessary information and then lower the probability of getting hired.
No, that's a fantastic point, Suri. Thank you so much. In fact, in our paper, we do mention one of the themes on disclosure that I addressed. It wasn't obviously in the interest of time fleshed out fully, but there were several participants of our study, SBOs, who said, look, if your disability isn't apparent, if it is in fact invisible, because we have a personal experience with, the backlash of living with a disability, keep your mouth shut, secure your job, and disclose per your rights under the ADA, which is sound advice. But the question here is, what do people with apparent disabilities do in the name of impression management? And so one of our studies, as I mentioned, found that if we can emphasize our hard skills, where we're really demonstrating our chops, our aptitude apropos the job, that might overcome the stigma of disability. Now, whether in fact this is true in every job or in every industry, or even among SBOs, is the question that we're still trying to unpack. And hopefully with medium-sized firms, we'll have a better understanding of how amenable SBOs are, or medium-sized firms are, in wanting to demonstrate what is morally appropriate in their mind's eye, at least according to what these SBOs indicated. So stay tuned, but definitely an excellent point. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer.
I have one question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I like the reason presented why people with disability, the employment rate has increased during the pandemic. The two reasons. One is the tightened labor market, and the other one is the possibility of teleworking that's created as a result of this COVID-19. Is there any way to know which one is really the driving force or the relative magnitude of the two, if possible?
Well, I'll just jump in there and say that that was one of that exact question is really why we were, what inspired us to look at the effects of tight labor markets by using that state level of unemployment rate, as Yana was describing. We wanted to figure out, what can we disentangle somehow? What role do tight labor markets have in employment in general, and what role do they have for telework? And the results so far, at least, seem to indicate that the tight labor markets are good for both telework employment and non-telework employment for people with and without disabilities, but it's especially good for telework employment for people with disabilities. So there seems to be a bit of a change in the composition there, but we really wanted to find some way of looking at what going forward, what kind of implications are there for post-pandemic time in terms of what's going to be driving telework. And so that was kind of the inspiration for putting in the state level unemployment rate. Hey, if we really do have a good hot labor market that continues, hopefully, what will this mean? So yeah, you raised the right question. How can we separate out those two factors? And that's what we're trying to do there.
Yeah, thank you.
And I wanted to jump in and say closely related was Sophie's question. And we did another paper using all the same data, and we found that people with disabilities were indeed more likely to have lower employment rates due to the pandemic or during the pandemic. So employment losses were greater, relative employment losses were greater for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities. And we did a decomposition analysis and showed that the main explanation for that is the occupations in which people with disabilities work. They were more likely to lose their jobs because of shutdowns during the pandemic in these particular occupations. But it's interesting, in the telework regressions, even after we control for occupations, we still see that people with two kinds of disabilities, the cognitive impairments and mobility impairments, are more likely to telework, even after we control for occupation, but not the other kind of disabilities.
Well, and I'll just add, tying into your own work, Abe, we did look at the racial intersection there as well in the effects on job loss, and found that there was greater job loss among both white and Black women with disabilities. So looking at that, I was really interested, as I said, to see your paper earlier today, and I think exploring that the intersection of race and disability is well, it's obviously important. Any last questions? We're 2 minutes over, but as I say, we can cheat a little.
I potentially have a comment for Mason regarding his paper, which is I found the rationale that the small businesses used for why they wanted early disclosure to be interesting. It was a little bit different from what I would normally expect to hear from the big businesses. But then, as I thought about it, I realized that even though the rationale was different, the actual result wasn't necessarily different from what I would expect. I would expect larger businesses to do it because they're more likely to be government contractors, or to say that they want more disclosure because they're government contractors and want to be able to get credit for employing workers with disabilities under contractor regulations. Yeah. And yet, when we do the studies looking at employment, whether disclosure in the resume, for example, winds up hurting potential employment, we see that it does indeed tend to. And so basically we wind up in a situation where we have the big businesses who have an incentive to want early disclosure, small businesses who appear to want early disclosure, and yet the the businesses in total aren't acting in accordance with that. And so I guess my question is how much these results might be impacted by, at least among the small businesses, might be impacted by social desirability bias.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, that's a very heavy question.
Sorry.
I personally, not to fault you at all, not at all. I think that there is a chance of social desirability. You know, even in qualitative research like semi-structured interviews, where quite frankly, for an hour, we had this amazing conversation with each of these SBOs. I will say though, kind of referencing theme number 3, which we didn't unpack, there is an important question of fit within the family-like environment that each of these SBOs created.
Okay.
There were so many anecdotes of SBOs indicating that if their staff aren't on board in a very authentic way, that the job candidate's experience is, you know, that matters, sure, but if you're not one of us in disclosing who you are, all of who you are in this family-like environment, then you don't get a chance to play, right? In fact, I had one SBO in accounting who said, I don't feel like a boss. I don't want to be a boss. I just happen to own this thing and let's do this together. That really resonated with me because much like my dad, he owns an auto shop. He's like, this is my baby. This is my baby. So anyone who wants to be of this family has to play by a particular kind of playbook. And disclosure is one of those things. And it could be about disability, it could be about anything that would potentially limit productivity in this case, right? And so I would venture to say that maybe they were being more sincere than what the literature has found as far as social desirability bias, et cetera. But who's to say? Certainly, this is just laying the groundwork for us to kind of unpack it further in a more quantitative way. So stay tuned.
Thank you very much.
That's great. Those great comments. I see Bernadette lurking there. She's probably going to kick us off here. And there's another session starting in just 9 minutes that I need to be at. So thank you all very much. I think we managed very well to put those 4 papers into a good the interesting results and good discussant comments and good questions. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with any and all of you.
And thank you, Doug. Thank you, Doug, for organizing this session, and Lisa also for your work.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Kathy.
Hello.
Oh,
Sophie.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I was like, are you really there?
I'm really here. I'm behind the curtain.
All right. Hi, Wellen. Not there yet.
I'm going to share our program, Kathy.
What'd you say?
Hi, Jennifer.
Hello.
You made co-host.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm going to stop the recording from earlier.